I'm going to begin tonight again with corrections and retractions, okay? I made a statement last week that the Dome of the Rock was a mosque, and I made that statement based upon the fact that the California textbook that I taught out of mentioned it as a place of worship. It is actually, the Dome of the Rock is a shrine, okay? It's part of a 35-acre complex on the previous Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So the Dome of the Rock is a shrine. However, people do recite the Quran inside of the Dome of the Rock. They do pray inside of the Dome of the Rock. So they treat it like a mosque, and maybe that's why the California textbook said it that way. What's interesting about this, that as I was looking at it, is that it is supposed to be in Islamic history the place where Muhammad was taken from his original place. When he died, he was taken there, and then he went up into the seventh heaven, according to Islamic legend or that. And so what's interesting is that most Muslims today will say that's where this happened, and that's why they built the Dome of the Rock. But in all actuality, the Dome of the Rock was built first, okay? And then later on, it occurred in Islamic literature that he ascended to seventh heaven from that place. So in 638 AD, when Jerusalem was conquered by the Muslims, the Dome of the Rock and another nearby mosque were actually built, okay? So the reason for the Dome of the Rock as a shrine, some have conjectured that it was, we have conquered Christianity, or we have made a statement to Judaism. I don't know that. I'm not going to make any judgment about that. I just wanted to correct that. Then a question last week. According to Islam, was Jesus born of a virgin? The answer to that is yes. Muslims believe that Jesus was the son of Mary and was conceived without the intervention of a human father. That's what it states there. However, Mary was never betrothed to Joseph in Islamic tradition, and instead of actually carrying the baby in public, she went into hiding and then gave birth to the baby outside of a certain area under a date palm that was miraculous and that gave her sustenance while she gave birth to Jesus. Remember, however, Muslims do not believe, even though they believe that Jesus was sinless, they do not believe that he is the Son of God, and nor do they believe it is correct for the New Testament to say so or for the Gospels to say so. That would be misinterpreted, okay, or misapplied. Okay, so going through those, we will now tackle what my wife says when we were talking about this last week. She said, I do not want to be in your shoes on Sunday night when you try dealing with this. But I want you to know that I'm going to attempt in every way to deal with this the way a true disciple of Christ ought to deal with this subject, okay? So we are now going to jump into the two things that are probably the most controversial about Islam. Let's go first with Sharia law, okay? Now, I'm going to refer to this book and to this guy as an expert on Islamic tradition and the history of Islam and Muhammad, etc. And so his name is Lutzer. This book was given to me by Tom Degeneff. I've read through it. It's a very fine book. And so I am going to be quoting from it, and I highly recommend it. I think it has a very, very good understanding. Now, I'm going to say that he's made some conclusions that I'm not sure I'm ready to make, but I will tell you what his conclusions are, and I think that that will be helpful to you. Again, our purpose is to be able to spread the gospel to these people, okay? We want to be able to share the gospel intelligently to Muslims, all right? So So I will tell you about this book, and then I will also quote from it up here. Sharia law is the Islamic legal system. It's a legal and political system, actually. And the key word is it's derived from religious precepts of Islam. It doesn't have to be taken directly from it. In other words, you can look at a particular aspect or tenet of Islam, and then you derive it in Sharia law. Now, as it's particularly, these precepts come from the Quran and from the Hadith. Or the Hadith is, remember, those oral traditions which have been elevated to the aspect of law, especially by a certain segment of the Muslims, all right? It comes from the Arabic language, Sharia, as I guess how you say that, which means a body of moral and religious prophecy. That means spoken from God as opposed to human legislation. So when an area is Muslimized, whether by conquering in ancient times, or what ISIS is doing today, or what happens in Afghanistan by certain extreme Muslims, then Sharia law is imposed. You might have understood that in Pakistan, that Sharia law does not allow women, you may have heard that, in its most, in its strictest sense, does not allow women to go to school, okay? And remember the one Pakistani or Indian young girl who went to school and then was shot and you know, she wasn't killed, etc. going on. All right, so, so this is Sharia law in its extreme form. I'm not saying Sharia law is applied everywhere. I just found out recently that Turkey has basically said, you know what, Sharia law is not in concert with a democratic republic, which we are supposed to have. So therefore you cannot impose it. Well, that's quite interesting, all right? So what I will tell you is that my understanding of Sharia law and a democratic republic like the United States of America is that they aren't in concert with one another. They cannot be in concert with one another because they don't allow any other religious freedom. Sharia law does not allow that. Okay, so I'm going to quote now right here. Sharia is not optional for Muslims. For a Muslim to accept Islam and deny Sharia would be similar to a Jew who claims to accept the 5 books of the Torah but rejects the 10 commandments. In the eyes of Muslim supremacists or Islamists, anyone who is perceived as advocating change that questions or undermines Sharia and therefore undermines the Quran or the Sunnah, which in one of its definitions is related to the Hadith, that person is considered a hypocrite, a dissenter, an apostate who has committed a grave offense against Allah. So it's a serious thing to say Sharia law should not be imposed here. The concern about Sharia law, especially in places like America and in Europe, is that it looks as though, well, it doesn't even look as though, there are Muslims who are leaders in leadership position who want to get it imposed in enclaves in certain places in the United States and in Europe and in other places where it's not an Islamic country, and then appeal to the religious tolerance or freedom laws of that country to impose Sharia law there. All right, which would not only have to do with political situations, but also moral situations as well. In other words, if you were to have Sharia law imposed in an enclave in the United States of America, you could not wear certain things. You could, modesty, there are certain rules of modesty that women right here in this building would be all out of compliance to Sharia law, okay? Secondly, you wouldn't be able to take intoxicating beverages in there. There are certain other things that goes along with it. It controls a lot, almost every aspect. So Islam is not a religion where it states that a separation of church and state is acceptable. The joining of church and state is absolutely necessary in Islam if it's going to be done correctly, if it's going to be done according to Muhammad. Now, remember what I said last week? Muhammad, recognizing this, was, I think, quite foolish not to name a successor, because he caused the division in Islam today of Sunnis and Shia, because of the fact that it is joined together, and there has to be a political element to Islamic conquering or Islamic states, and his not stating, hey, here's my successor, then that led to a division which caused death and wars, and has done that ever since. I mean, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni who had horrific, acts of violence against Shiites in his country. And Iran is basically Shiite in their leadership, one of the few countries which is. And so the war between Iran and Iraq is not really that far from what you would expect. Okay? Any questions about Sharia law? Okay, now I'm going to share the judgment of Erwin Lutzer. He believes that this is the most dangerous part of an influx of Muslims in any place in the world, because he believes that moderate Muslims are bullied in a sense. He doesn't use that word, but they're bullied in a sense never to speak out against Sharia law, even though they might come to the United States for political freedom and freedom against persecution. When they get here and when they collect together, as do many people from other nations, they might collect together like the Chinese do, in Roland Heights and in Hacienda Heights, and as other enclaves, a collection together of people, then after a while, what is going to be expected is that Muslim leadership is going to continue to redress that in the American government to get that part of that area to impose Sharia law. To do so is a violation, I believe, of American law. That American law must supersede that. Politically speaking, that's what I believe. As a Christian, that's not my goal in life, to make sure that Sharia law is not enclaved in certain places in the world, any more than it's my goal in life to make sure that there wouldn't be communism in certain places, okay? But his judgment is this, that when Islam began, and Muhammad and the other caliphs, and that's how you say it, by the way, it's not caliphs. We English people call it caliphs. Okay, so caliphs started these campaigns, these military campaigns, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And they took over certain areas. To take over an area and Islamize that area and make Sharia law the law of the land, you should never, that area must be fought over with tooth and nail. You may not ever acquiesce that land, ever, to someone that does not impose Sharia law. So Osama bin Laden went ballistic when Saudi Arabia said, yes, you can have some land here, the US, Great Britain, and France, to do your military campaign against Muslims in Iraq. It just freaked out. He just said, that's a violation. You can never do that. You acquiesced sacred land to do so. Now, if that's the case with Muslim supremacists and Sharia law is imposed, I might just say to you, politically speaking, that that's something that Americans should be concerned about. As far as whether or not a Christian needs to be concerned about that, I'm going to make other statements about that later on. All right, now do you have any questions? Do you see what might happen if we were to acquiesce a certain land area to Sharia law, and then all of a sudden somebody says, no, we're going to legislate against that and pull it out? and allow people to go in and violate Sharia law, then they violated a holy area. Isn't that interesting? Okay. All right. So that's just some information there. Now we're going to tackle the next part. You either are looking at me like, oh my goodness, I didn't get that, or I have about 400 questions and I couldn't ask all of them. I'm not sure. 5 pillars of Islam. These are always talked about. I taught this, or 7th grade teachers teach this all over America because they study Islam. I actually taught it as well because I wanted them to understand what was going to happen to Jerusalem and Palestine later on in its history. There's a declaration of faith, okay? Now, the declaration of faith is very, very simple, but it has to be done with a full heart. And we'll look at that in just a moment. That's how you become a Muslim. You just declare your faith. There is no baptism at all. There is no ritual at all. You just declare. But you must declare with a full heart. Secondly, there's prayer. 5 times a day, prayer. In Islamic countries, you will hear a call to prayer 5 times a day when you are to kneel down and face toward Mecca and pray. Why? Because Gabriel included that according to Muhammad while he was revealing to him to pray those times during the day. So they pray when they get up, and they pray during the morning, and then they pray during the afternoon, they pray during the evening, and then they pray before they go to bed, okay? All right, the zakat, I hope I'm saying that correctly, or charity. This, you might say, wow, only 2.5%. Every Muslim is expected to give 2.5%. Listen, though, this is quite high in charity. Of all of their money and all of the value of their ownings above a certain minimum. So there's a minimum, and then there's 2.5%. As an American living in Yorba Linda, my house is worth more than $500,000. I would have to, as a Muslim, give and then compute that as well, 2.5% of, 500,000 or more than that money, and then calculate that and give that. Now, that's been a cause of conflict between Shiites and Sunnis, again, because the Shiites believe, hey, it should be something that is of your own personal giving. And the Sunnis say, no, it's a tax. You will be taxed this and you will give it. And if you're a Christian living in an Islamic country, you may be allowed to live there. You won't be allowed to preach the gospel openly. You won't be allowed to do a lot of different things. You won't be allowed to violate their Sharia law as far as modesty or intoxicating beverages or other thing like that. And also, you will have to give a certain tax which is above the zakat because you are not a Muslim. So the fact that this man right here said, there are times in history when persecution hasn't resulted in an explosion of Christianity. And that was the time in the 600s and 700s and early 800s when this Muslim oppression, as he calls it, and conquering and military jihad conquered all of these areas and created an empire. Christian quote-unquote churches went down. Church buildings were demolished everywhere. And there was high-level persecution among Christians. And so we have to say, that Turkey once was a really great place for Christianity, right? There are 7 churches of Asia were in that area. And of course, history bears out what happened to that. So I don't know whether I agree with that. Was it because Christians were so lax that the persecution then didn't result in a real, zealousness for God and a real zeal for God, like it was in the 1st century when the Roman Empire said it's an illegal religion and we're going to squash it, and it never happened, and the opposite happened? Is it because the Christians in China are willing to be persecuted and willing to give whatever they have to give, that, as Mike said today, it is the fastest growing Christian community in the world? What's the reason for that happening? He thinks that it may have been God's judgment upon mediocre Christianity. So therefore, he believes that the real concern among American Christians is not military jihad. He said, it's the influx of Muslims where we're just not going to be, where we're not going to be the kind of people that go out and teach them the gospel and recognize that we need to be campaigning for Jesus Christ and that our churches are so mediocre, they're just going to be conquered. You can read the book and decide for yourself. The fourth pillar, the fast of Ramadan. The fast of Ramadan is a very, very important fast. It happens once a year. It is basically what all Islamic people or all Muslims have to do. It is in their 9th month. It's a worldwide month of fasting. I think it occurs right around in January for us, but in their calendar, it's their 9th month. It's to commemorate the first revelation of Quran to Muhammad according to Islamic belief. So during that time, it is 29 to 30 days. And so in that time period, you have to fast. That is a very important thing. So if you know any Muslims during Ramadan, if they are devout Muslim, they will eat in the morning during Ramadan, that 29 to 30 days, eat during the morning before the sun comes up. The moment the sun comes up, they are in fasting of everything that they eat, and no drinking of liquids either, and no smoking, and no engaging in sexual relations with one's spouse during the daylight time period. Okay? Muslims are also instructed to refrain from sinful behavior because they might negate the reward of fasting. Remember, this is a works-based righteousness type of religion. So you don't want to negate your fasting by doing something like yelling at your wife or having a family quarrel during that time and backbiting and gossiping about people or something like that. Okay? And then 1/30 of the Quran is to be recited each day in the mosques. So if you were to go to the mosque every day during Ramadan, you would hear the entire Quran recited by the end of Ramadan. Okay? That's one of the pillars. And then finally, a pilgrimage. Every Muslim, it's mandatory that you go to Saudi Arabia and that you get yourself to ancient Yathrib, which today is Medina, which is where Muhammad fled to when he went from Mecca to Medina, when he was kicked out, so to speak, and persecuted by the polytheist in Mecca. And he went there, so they start at Medina and they do the opposite. They go to Mecca, okay? And they do that pilgrimage. And you're supposed to do it at least once in your life here are the conditions. If you're healthy enough, if you have enough money, and if you're physically able to do that. So you need to take that opportunity as a devout Muslim to do that at least once. And by the way, that is a time of great unification of Muslims. They, basically speaking, don't get onto each other for being a Sunni or Shiite. They join together and they have that in common, these 5 pillars right here, although they do disagree about how charity is supposed to be done. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about the fasting for children. What age is it that they do that?
Well, I will also say fasting is to be done only if you are physically able to do it. I don't know about the age, but I forgot to say this. If you're a diabetic or somebody like that, then according to their tradition, you do not have to fast in that manner. Okay? Yes, Kelly?
I think it's usually around puberty, and then also they practice it. So the kids will fast until 12 o'clock, just to practice it and get ready.
Oh, to get ready. Okay, cool. Thank you, Kelly. Alicia?
I'm not sure if you said they eat first thing in the morning. I'm not sure if you completed that.
No, I didn't complete that statement. Thank you. Yeah, there's basically, when the sun goes down, there's a feast at night. And that's a great time of fellowship for Muslims when the sun goes down, big dinners. Okay, lots to eat. Okay? Yes?
I was just going to comment and say, when I was in Egypt a couple years ago, Ramadan occurred during that time. And so it was very interesting because I found myself, I would order dinner with my friend, and then we'd sit and just wait for the bells to kind of ring everywhere around dinner time. And then once everyone else started eating, then we just naturally had that habit. But I'll also say that that was probably the scariest time I was there because everyone was so angry during the day.
Oh.
Oh. Coffee or anything.
Oh.
So, I mean, people were like at dinner time, they're pulling guns out because their sandwich wasn't made right, and we're like hiding in a nearby building, like, wait, my shawarma's not done. I can't get it yet. When are the guns gonna leave?
Okay.
They say it's works-based, and then I mean that was like the angriest time that I was there.
Okay, well, that's quite an interesting one. Okay, by the way, yes.
The lunar cycle looks like it happens in June and July.
Oh, that's right. What happens in January, though?
It changes every year.
That's right. I remember, since it's what did you say? Super Bowl. The Super Bowl does, if anybody missed that, on the YouTube.
The dates aren't always set.
That's correct. That's because it's a lunar cycle, then it's going to change all the time during the year. I'm sorry. Okay, this is how you become a Muslim. If you truly believe in Muslim theology and you just say these words, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, you become a Muslim. If they are conquering you and you refuse to say that, then it could be death if they're in a military jihad. Now remember, ISIS doesn't, to them it doesn't matter sometimes. They don't care whether or not you're going to say this. There are certain people that are not worthy of continuing to live. But there are going to be Muslims, many Muslims, that are going to say, but those guys are extremists. Okay? They will say that. So, is there a sixth pillar of Islam that we would call military jihad? In your literature that I gave you, if you go and look at a certain page in there, I can't remember which page it is, but it talks about the Kharijites that were a tribe that came, a Muslim tribe that came into being after Muhammad died, and they did raise military jihad to a sixth pillar of Islam, and they believed that it was appropriate. Now, I'm going to make some statements right now about this, okay? And I'm going to read some of them because I want to make sure that I'm saying this in the way that I want to say it. So listen very carefully, and I hope I measure my words correctly. My judgment is that there are so many internal discrepancies and contradictions in the Quran and the Hadith and in Muhammad's life that it is very, very hard for Muslims themselves to come to a conclusion whether jihad is military or simply, as the word means, a struggle. Moderate Muslims will say it's an inner struggle between good and evil. Well, then Christians go through jihad, don't we? We know the struggle of flesh and spirit, all of that. Okay? But when you look at the life of Muhammad, and when you look at the military campaigns that occurred right after he died, and while he was still living, then you can be very confused by the language of the Quran, which states, and I quote from a source that quotes it in English, of course, I can't say it in Arabic, there will be no compulsion in religion. Well, that's a really good statement. But is that actually brought out in Muslim history? I have to say no. Okay. So military jihad is definitely, according to Muhammad, supposed to happen if anyone ever goes in and tries to take your sacred land that has already been Islamized and given to God as a sacred covenant to God, so to speak, or if anyone ever tries to make you, force you into a different religion, you must fight. That's a very different thing from Christianity. In the first century, when people were forced to denounce Jesus or die, they didn't think, okay, I'm supposed to fight the Roman government. No. They either sadly denounced their Savior in order to save their lives, or proudly said, I'm not going to. I confess that he is my Savior and Lord, and died. So that is a very different thing. So I'm going to now just make this statement. Am I afraid of Muslims? I'm going to ask that question. The answer that I'm going to give you is no. I'm not afraid of Muslims. Am I afraid of Muslim extremists? Well, yes, of course I am. But I'm also afraid of Mexican drug lords, gang members of LA, the Russian mafia, and mentally ill people who are armed with automatic weapons and ammunition, especially in theaters. Okay? So, yes, I'm afraid of extremists, and I think I have to have a natural fear of them. And recognize this as well. Many so-called Christians have done horrific acts in the name of their religion. If I lived in the Middle Ages, I can tell you right now from my study and what happened in the history of, quote, the church in the Middle Ages, I would be scared to death of certain church officials and some popes, without a doubt. The Spanish and French Inquisitions were horrific. They were torturous. The executions of those who tried to translate the Bible out of Latin, which isn't even the original language, into their common language, and lost their lives by being burned at the stake, is replete in history. You can see it again and again and again, and it's considered historic fact. The Crusades, although I have come to believe, started as a defensive war in order to rescue Christians from the oppression that had happened in the last 200 years with the takeover of, quote, holy lands and Christian areas and the destruction of churches, etc., turned terribly ugly, and extreme acts of terror, violence, and torture were done in the name of our Lord on non-combatants. Study it for yourselves if you don't believe it. Go and study it for yourselves. So would I be afraid of them? Yes, I would. Okay. Would I be afraid to say anything to a church official during the Middle Ages that he might consider to be heresy? And a lot of what I believe today was considered heretical back in that time. Absolutely heretical. I read my Bible myself, and that was considered heretical and worthy of death in the name of Christ. Now, I think there is a remarkable difference, though, between what Christianity is supposed to be and what Islam is purported to be. Right-thinking, true disciples of Christ recognize and deplore those acts of violence that I just mentioned in the name of Christianity and the name of our Savior, and how much their Lord abhors the same acts. I cannot say the same for some Muslims, though, and especially the current Muslim leadership in certain Muslim countries. If someone insults my Savior, I am saddened and sorrowful for their soul. And I believe that should be my response as a Christian. If someone insults Muhammad, violent retribution seems to be accepted and sometimes applauded as part of their religious duty. Do you see the difference there? I hope you do. Okay? And I think I will highlight that difference when we look in just a moment at the differences between Muhammad and Jesus. I said before this class to someone, I can't remember who it was, that I wonder whether we're just in a time of history where Islam is much more violent. And I wonder whether it's because of what happened in the history. Remember, the Romans exiled the Jews from their homeland 132 AD. By the 700s AD, all of Palestine was conquered by the Muslim Empire. Then, 800s to 1,000, very bad persecution of Christians and of churches, etc. The Crusades fail in the 1000s to the 1200s AD. And then, fast forward to World War II, where extermination of 6 million Jews occur in 1939 to 1945. And after that happens, then those who are what were called, basically the new zealots of Judaism were saying, we got to go back to the land. They are now today in history called Zionists. They said, we got to go back to the land. That's our land. That's our land. And in our country, we, the United States of America, lent support to that. So therefore, the UN lent support to that. So a new state of Israel occurs in a holy land of Islam. You have to understand. Okay? The U.S. supports the Zionists with arms, or they would have never won. Palestinians become refugees in their own land, quote unquote. The birth of Palestinian terrorism occurs after the 1967 Six-Day War because, again, it was U.S. military might that the Jews used, that the Israelis used in order to defeat those countries that were about to obliterate them and rescue Palestine for the refugees. And the first Persian Gulf War, Saudi Arabia, was used as a U.S. air base, and Osama bin Laden begins his al-Qaeda organization. I wonder if the political climate hadn't been the way it was, and if oil hadn't been found all over the Middle East, that we would be seeing such terrorist type of activity and extreme activity by Muslims today. That's just my wondering. I'll leave that for you to think about as well, okay? Because there's a time in history that I would have been fearful for my life being a true disciple of Jesus Christ. And I would have been fearful of others who call themselves Christians. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. So I just wonder about that. Do you have any questions or comments about those statements? Yes, Tom?
Question.
Sure.
Based on the tenets of Islam, say that the political scenario that you just described wasn't an issue, just that there was no reason politically for us to be involved over there at all. Would the tenets of their religion be satisfied with having Sharia law like dominate the Middle East and so forth, and just leave it at that, or are they expansionists to where, hey, as long as any place on the globe is not Sharia law, they've got expansion in mind?
I'll answer that question by this. The goal of Islam is to Islamize the entire earth and the entire world. You have to understand that. Now, the goal of Christianity is to convert everyone, but the goal of Christianity is not to make every single nation, I hope, into a democratic republic. That's American Christianity, and it's a bastard Christianity in my mind. Christianity can survive in a monarchy, in a democracy, in a republic, in a totalitarian government, in a fascist government, in any government that there is. According to Islam, it needs to spread over the whole world and give this entire earth back to Allah. That's how I'll answer. Okay? Yes, Alicia.
Well, given that, then would it really matter, all those things you listed on that slide earlier?
I don't know.
I mean, if that is their goal,
I don't know. And I'm willing to say, you know what happened on that. Now I'm going to give you some similarities at the end of my class today. I'm going to give you some similarities between two religions that I think are strikingly similar. You're going to say, what? Islam and Mormonism? Why would you think they're similar? Well, I think that we have to be ready and prepared to speak to Mormons as we would be ready to speak to Muslims. And I think that we have to be ready on these 5 elements. Number 1, both were begun by one man stating an angel gave them a latter-day revelation. Muhammad said it was Gabriel, and Joseph Smith said it was the angel Moroni. Both men claim to be the final prophet. Both men state that their prophecy is greater than Jesus's. Both state the Bible is erroneous, misinterpreted, and corrupted in translation. And that everything the Book of Mormon or Pearl of Great Price or Doctrines and Covenants, their 3 most important books, states that is in contradiction to the Bible, or anything that the Quran or Hadith state that is in contradiction to the Bible, then the others win out. The Bible is erroneous, as it's been misinterpreted, mistranslated, misapplied, etc. etc. Okay? Both the Quran and the Book of Mormon are not themselves sufficient for the respective religions. You cannot get Islam out of the Quran only. You can't get it. You have to have the oral traditions. You have to have all the rest of it. And you cannot have Mormonism with only the Book of Mormon. It's just a history book. Well, it's a supposed history. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be insulting in any way. I have read the Book of Mormon. And I have a master's degree in English, and I think I've read great literature before. And I would have to say that that's not great literature. And it's not a good history. Okay? So, both of them cannot sustain their religions alone. They have to have those other books and other writings. And both the Quran and Book of Mormon have glaring discrepancies in scientific errors. If you go, all you have to do, and you say, Mark, give us this. You have an internet. Okay? All you have to do is just say, type in discrepancies in the Quran. I will give you some tonight, okay? And have you look at them. But it's really easy to find. You can find the same. I mean, one of the great scientific errors that is in Mormonism today is that of course, Joseph Smith makes the claim that it was Jews in 586 BC that escaped from Jerusalem, got in a very poorly made boat, and went all the way across the Atlantic Ocean in that boat, and ended up in America and populated America. And that's where the American Indians came from, because Joseph Smith, even though nobody could figure out at that time where the American Indians came from, he decided he would be the one that got a revelation from an angel that stated this is why they came here. And their DNA, Native Americans' DNA, is in no way, shape, or form consistent with Jews. But it is strikingly consistent with people in Eastern Asia and Mongolian people and others that could have come across the strait up there and come back down, which is how most people believe. Anthropologists believe that the Americans were populated by Native Americans. Okay? Scientific errors there. Scientific error with, the Quran as well. Let me just give you some of those discrepancies and errors. The Quran states that man was created out of nothing in one place, a drop of congealed blood in another place, dust in another place, clay in another place, and a drop of sperm in another place. 5 different ways of saying there was a creation. The biblical account of creation is completely and utterly unified throughout all of the Bible. In one place in the Quran it states, let there be no compulsion in religion. In other places it states to, quote, hunt down pagans, beleaguer them, lie in wait for them, fight and slay them, end quote. I call that a discrepancy. Number 3, the Quran states that it is an unforgivable sin to worship an idol, but also states that the Israelites were forgiven for their cow worship. Number 4, intoxicating beverages are called an abomination in one section of the Quran and are clearly against Sharia law, but in 2 different places in the Quran, paradise will have, quote, rivers of wine in it, and Muslims' thirst will be, quote, sated with pure wine, end quote, in paradise. The Quran says that, trying not to in any way insult, I'm trying to just give you this. The Quran says that Alexander the Great was a Muslim and died at a ripe old age. It is a historical fact that he was not Muslim. He was a Greek-ized polytheist of the, he read the Iliad and the Odyssey with all the gods and in it, and he had a copy of it wherever he went. Okay? And he died at the age of 33. He died as a young man. It also states that Jews believed that Ezra was the Messiah. We have no historical record that Jews believed that Ezra was the Messiah. And there's nothing in the Bible that ever states something like that. And in one place it says that the earth was created in 8 days, and another it was created in 6 days. So there are some glaring discrepancies inside the Bible. Now, if you Google discrepancies in the Bible, you'll see what modernists think are discrepancies in the Bible. I challenge you to go look at them and see if you can answer them. I think that what I've given you is something that I'm trying to say are the similarities between these books, because they're both started by one man. And when men start religions, there are going to be discrepancies. There are going to be problems. There's going to be internal errors that confuse people. I really believe that peace-loving Muslims are confused by their religion. That they don't know what to believe in this. I think the history of Muhammad states that at the beginning he wrote the things, and remember these are being scribed down by some people, he wrote the things like there will be no compulsion in religion. By the end of his life, when he realized that that's not going to work, and he's not going to be able to create the vision of what he's got, then he says, you hunt down those pagans, you beleaguer them, you slay them, you do this and that. So it's confusing. So I believe in the beginning that he thought he could peacefully do what he was about to do, was walk into Mecca and say, I'm the prophet of God, and you all are to be monotheistic. And they all said, nuts to you, dude. Get out of here. So he flees to, he flees to Medina, and from that place, he has to go preach again and preach again. It became increasingly difficult for him to get the job done. And conquering got the job done really fast. So I think that that's the problem. Now, how can we help these people? Well, there are some similarities of Judaism, of Christianity, and of Islam. And I hope this is what you take. And these are the places like what Paul did in Acts, the 17th chapter, when he was in Athens, and he thought, how am I going to find? I can just see Paul walking through the city going, what commonality do I have as a disciple of Christ with these people? And it was just, the Holy Spirit moving him right past that idol, so many idols in the city, he moves past the idol that says to the unknown God, and he goes, I've got it. I've got it. We have a commonality. They have given an idol to an unknown God, and I know the God that they don't know. Okay, so here are some commonalities. We all believe in the same God, in the sense that it's the same God, the God of Abraham. Now, do I believe how they've created Allah, or how Judaism has created Yahweh is the same God that I believe in? No. But in history, we all believe that the God of Abraham is our God. Secondly, we all believe that Moses and Jesus are great prophets. Okay? You can talk about Jesus as a great prophet, and they will accept that. Thirdly, we all believe that Abraham is our father. Not a physical father to Christians, but certainly the father of faith to us all, according to Galatians, the 3rd chapter. And fourthly, we all believe in angels as instruments of God to reveal His word. But we have a passage in the New Testament in Galatians that says that even an angel of heaven, anyone or an angel of heaven, preach any other gospel than that which has been preached, let him be accursed. Joseph Smith and Muhammad both fell to that. Whether they believed truly in the angel that gave them that latter-day revelation or not, they fell to that verse. And they failed in keeping that verse. Questions or comments? Yes, sir.
If I were to speak to a Muslim, it seems to me like the entire Muslim community would be a little upset.
Not necessarily.
But a little upset at the United States government and Saudi Arabia.
Not necessarily so in my, I don't think so in my experience, nor in the ones that I've heard have talked to them. But you might get the same thing that happens with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses when they cannot answer your questions or concerns. They might bring in the heavy artillery. Which, have you ever experienced that before when you've been talking to them and they can't answer questions, and then the next week someone comes in who is their like religious mentor, and they will tell you where it is, and the other person then kind of is silent. So that might be the extent of their being upset. Now, I didn't hear from, let's see, who was it last week that told me their experience? It was me. She went up and talked to some Muslims that were kind of, giving out pamphlets on Islam and all of this kind of stuff, and she stated her belief in Jesus, and she said they got angry. Okay. Well, I talked to atheists before that had a little booth out of Balboa Park that got real angry at me too. I'm sure that Christians have been talked to before about something that they don't believe in and they get angry about. Okay? Religion can do that to people. That's why some people say, in this room, we'll not talk about religion or politics, because they see that it gets people angry. Okay? What we have to do, folks, is we have to be like Christ in that situation. We have to show forth what Mike said today, grace with the truth. A gracious answer. Study how Jesus graciously answered people. Study how Paul answered them. Study how people in your lifetime have been up against someone who has upbraided them for their belief and have given such a calm and gracious and loving answer about Jesus. Because then you glorify your Lord, even if they don't believe, and especially if they don't still
wait, my shawarma's not done, I didn't get it yet, when are the guns gonna leave? So, they say it's works-based, and then, I mean, that was like the angriest time that I was there.
Okay, well, that's quite an interesting one. Okay, by the way.
In March, based
yes.
on the lunar cycle, looks like it happens in June and July.
Oh, that's right. What happens in January, though?
No,
It changes every year.
That's
Because
right.
they don't have a-
I remember, since it's a, what did you say?
It's a
Super Bowl. The Super Bowl does, if anybody missed that.
The dates aren't always set.
That's correct. That's because it's a lunar cycle, then it's going to change all the time during the year. I'm sorry. Okay, this is how you become a Muslim. If you truly believe in Muslim theology, and you just say these words, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, you become a Muslim. If they are conquering you, and you refuse to say that, then it could be death. If they're in the military jihad. Now remember, ISIS doesn't, to them it doesn't matter sometimes. They don't care whether or not you're going to say this. There are certain people that are not worthy of continuing to live. But there are going to be Muslims, many Muslims, that are going to say, those guys are extremists. Okay? They will state that. So, is there a sixth pillar of Islam that we would call military jihad? In your literature that I gave you, if you go and look at a certain page in there, I can't remember which page it is, but it talks about the Khawarjites that were a tribe that came, a Muslim tribe that came into being after Muhammad died, and they did raise military jihad to a sixth pillar of Islam, and they believed that it was appropriate. Now, I'm going to make some statements right now about this, okay? And I'm going to read some of them because I want to make sure that I'm saying this in the way that I want to say it. So listen very carefully, and I hope I measure my words correctly. My judgment is that there are so many internal discrepancies and contradictions in the Quran and the Hadith and in Muhammad's life that it is very, very hard for Muslims themselves to come to a conclusion whether jihad is military or simply, as the word means, a struggle. Moderate Muslims will say it's an inner struggle between good and evil. Well, then Christians go through jihad, don't we? We know the struggle of flesh and spirit, all of that, okay? But when you look at the life of Muhammad, and when you look at the military campaigns that occurred right after he died, and while he was still living, then you can be very confused by the language of the Quran, which states, and I quote from a source that quotes it in English, of course, I can't say it in Arabic, there will be no compulsion in religion. Well, that's a really good statement. But is that actually brought out in Muslim history? I have to say no. Okay. So military jihad is definitely, according to Muhammad, supposed to happen if anyone ever goes in and tries to take your sacred land that has already been Islamized and given to God as a sacred.
They're pulling guns out because their sandwich wasn't made right, and we're like hiding in a nearby building like, wait, my shawarma's not done, I didn't get it yet, when are the guns gonna leave? So, they say it's works-based, and then, I mean, that was like the angriest time that I was there.
Okay, well, that's quite an interesting one. Okay, by the way.
In March, based
yes.
on the lunar cycle, looks like it happens in June and July.
Oh, that's right. What happens in January, though?
No,
It changes every year.
That's
Because
right.
they don't have a-
I remember, since it's a, what did you say?
It's a
Super Bowl. The Super Bowl does, if anybody missed that.
The dates aren't
That's correct. That's because it's a lunar cycle, then it's going to change all the time during the year. I'm sorry. Okay, this is how you become a Muslim. If you truly believe in Muslim theology, and you just say these words, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, you become a Muslim. If they are conquering you, and you refuse to say that, then it could be death. If they're in the military jihad. Now remember, ISIS doesn't, to them it doesn't matter sometimes. They don't care whether or not you're going to say this. There are certain people that are not worthy of continuing to live. But there are going to be Muslims, many Muslims, that are going to say, those guys are extremists. Okay? They will state that. So, is there a sixth pillar of Islam that we would call military jihad? In your literature that I gave you, if you go and look at a certain page in there, I can't remember which page it is, but it talks about the Khawarjites that were a tribe that came, a Muslim tribe that came into being after Muhammad died, and they did raise military jihad to a sixth pillar of Islam, and they believed that it was appropriate. Now, I'm going to make some statements right now about this, okay? And I'm going to read some of them because I want to make sure that I'm saying this in the way that I want to say it. So listen very carefully, and I hope I measure my words correctly. My judgment is that there are so many internal discrepancies and contradictions in the Quran and the Hadith and in Muhammad's life that it is very, very hard for Muslims themselves to come to a conclusion whether jihad is military or simply, as the word means, a struggle. Moderate Muslims will say it's an inner struggle between good and evil. Well, then Christians go through jihad, don't we? We know the struggle of flesh and spirit, all of that, okay? But when you look at the life of Muhammad, and when you look at the military campaigns that occurred right after he died, and while he was still living, then you can be very confused by the language of the Quran, which states, and I quote from a source that quotes it in English, of course, I can't say it in Arabic, there will be no compulsion in religion. Well, that's a really good statement. But is that actually brought out in Muslim history? I have to say no. Okay. So military jihad is definitely, according to Muhammad, supposed to happen if anyone ever goes in and tries to take your sacred land that has already been Islamized and given to God as a sacred